Hello, listening squirrels. We're on chapter 11 of the murder at the Vicarage. I saw a glance that Colonel Melchett and Inspector Hooker's Live is on. Hooker's Live, but Cuppy's Live is on too. I was over at her house. I didn't know Cuppy was going live, or I would have raided over there. But I wanted to go ahead and get this reading done before it gets too late and I get sleepy. Okay, I saw at a glance that Colonel Melchett and Inspector Slack had not been seen eye to eye about the case. Melchett looked flushed and annoyed, and the inspector looked sulky. "I'm sorry to say," said Melchett, "that Inspector Slack doesn't agree with me in considering young Redding innocent." "If he didn't do it, what does he go and say he did it for?" asked Slack skeptically. "Mrs. Prothero acted in an exactly similar fashion, remember, Slack? That's different. She's a woman, and women act in that silly way. I'm not saying she did it for a moment. She heard he was accused, and she trumped up a story. I'm used to that sort of game. You wouldn't believe the fool things I've known women to do. But Redding's different. He's got his head screwed on all right. And if he admits he did it, well, I say he did do it. It's his pistol. You can't get away from that. And thanks to this business of Mrs. Prothero, we know the motive. That was the weak point before, but now we know it. Why, the whole thing's plain sailing. You think he could have shot him earlier at 6:30, say? He can't have done that. You've checked up his movements?" The inspector nodded. "He was in the village near the Blue Boar at 6:10. From there he came along the back lane where you say you saw the old lady next door saw him. She doesn't miss much, I should say, and kept his appointment with Mrs. Prothero in the studio in the garden. They left there together just after 6:30 and went along the lane to the village, being joined by Dr. Stone. He corroborates that all right. I've seen him. They all stood talking just by the post office for a few minutes, and Mrs. Prothero went into Miss Hartnell's to borrow a gardening magazine. That's all right, too. I've seen Miss Hartnell. Miss Prothero remained there talking to her till just on 7 o'clock, when she exclaimed at the lateness of the hour and said she must get home. What was her manner? Very easy and pleasant, Miss Hartnell said. She seemed in good spirits. Miss Hartnell's quite sure there was nothing on her mind." "Well, go on." "Redding, he went with Dr. Stone to the Blue Boar, and they had a drink together. He left there at 20 minutes to 7, went rapidly along the village street and down the road to the vicarage. Lots of people saw him." "Not down the back lane this time?" commented the colonel. "No, he came to the front door, asked for the vicar, heard Colonel Prothero was there, went in and shot him just as he said he did. That's the truth of it, and we needn't look any further." Melchett shook his head. "There's the doctor's evidence. You can't get away from that. Prothero was shot not later than 6:30. "Oh, doctors!" Inspector Slack looked contemptuous. "If you're going to believe doctors, take out all your teeth. That's what they do nowadays, and then say they're very sorry, but all the time it was appendicitis." Doctors. "This isn't a question of diagnosis. Dr. Haydock was absolutely positive on the point. You can't go against the medical evidence, Slack." "And there's my evidence for what it's worth," I said, suddenly recalling a forgotten incident. "I touched the body and it was cold. That I can swear to." "You see, Slack," said Melchett. "Well, of course, if that's so, but there it was, a beautiful case. Mr. Redding only too anxious to be hanged, so to speak." "That in itself strikes me as a little unnatural," observed Colonel Melchett. "Well, there's no accounting for taste," said the inspector. "There's a lot of gentlemen went a bit balmy after the war. Now I suppose it means starting again at the beginning." He turned on me. Why you went out of your way to mislead me about the clock, sir, I can't think. Obstructing the ends of justice, that's what that was. I tried to tell you on 3 separate occasions, I said, and each time you shut me up and refused to listen. That's just a way of speaking, sir. You could have told me perfectly well if you'd had a mind to. The clock and the note seemed to tally perfectly. Now, according to you, the clock was all wrong. I never knew such a case. What's the sense of keeping a clock a quarter of an hour fast anyway? It's supposed, I said, to induce punctuality. I don't think we need to go further into that now, Inspector, said Colonel Melchett tactfully. What we want now is the true story from both Mrs. Prothero and young Redding. I telephoned to Haydock and asked him to bring Miss Prothero over here with him. They ought to be here in about a quarter of an hour. I think it would be as well to have Redding here first. I'll get on to the station, said Inspector Slack, and took up the telephone. And now, he said, replacing the receiver, we'll get to work on this room. He looked at me in a meaningful fashion. Perhaps, I said, you'd like me out of the way? The inspector immediately opened the door for me. Melchett called out, "Come back when young Redding arrives, will you, Vicar? You're a friend of his, and you may have sufficient influence to persuade him to speak the truth." I found my wife and Miss Marple with their heads together. "We've been discussing all sorts of possibilities," said Griselda. "I wish you'd solve the case, Miss Marple, like you did the time Miss Weatherby's gill of picked shrimps disappeared, and all because it reminded you of something quite different about a sack of coals." "You're laughing, my dear," said Miss Marple, "but after all, that is a very sound way of arriving at the truth. It's really what people call intuition and make such a fuss about. Intuition is like reading a word without having to spell it out. A child can't do that because it has had so little experience. But a grown-up person knows the word because they've seen it often before. You catch my meaning, Vicar?" "Yes," I said slowly, I think I do. You mean that if a thing reminds you of something else, well, it's probably the same kind of thing." "Exactly. And what precisely does the murder of Colonel Prothero remind you of?" Miss Marple sighed. "That's just the difficulty. So many parallels come to the mind. For instance, there was Major Hargraves, a churchwarden and a man highly respected in every way, and all the time he was keeping a second establishment, a former housemaid, just think of it, and 5 children, actually 5 children, a terrible shock to his wife and daughter. I tried hard to visualize Colonel Prothero in the role of secret sinner and failed. And then there was that laundry business," went on Miss Marple. "Miss Hartnell's opal pin left most imprudently in a frilled blouse and sent to the laundry. And the woman who took it didn't want it in the least and wasn't by any means a thief. She simply hid it in another woman's house and told the police she'd seen this other woman take it. Spite, you know. Sheer spite. It's an astonishing motive, spite. A man in it, of course, there always is. This time I failed to see any parallel, however remote. And then there was poor Elwell's daughter. Such a pretty, ethereal girl, tried to stifle her little brother, and there was the money for the choir boys' outing before your time, Vicar. Actually taken by the organist. His wife was sadly in debt. Yes, this case makes one think so many things, too many. It's very hard to arrive at the truth." "I wish you would tell me," I said. "Who were the 7 suspects?" "The 7 suspects? You said you could think of at least 7 people who would be glad of Colonel Prothero's death. Did I?" "Yes, I remember I did. Was that true?" "Oh, certainly it was true, but I mustn't mention names. You can think of them quite easily yourself, I'm sure." Indeed I can't. There is lettuce, Prothero, I suppose, since she probably comes into money on her father's death, but it's absurd to think of her in such a connection, and outside her I can think of nobody. And you, my dear, said Miss Marple, turning to Griselda. Rather to my surprise, Griselda colored up. Something very like tears started into her eyes. She clenched both her small hands. "Oh," she cried indignantly, "people are hateful, hateful. The things they say, the beastly things they say." I looked at her curiously. It's very unlike Griselda to be so upset. She noticed my glance and tried to smile. "Don't look at me as though I were an interesting specimen you didn't understand, Lynn. Don't let's get heated and wander from the point. I don't believe that it was Lawrence or Anne, and lettuce is out of the question. There must be some clue or other that would help us." "There's the note, of course," said Miss Marple. "You'll remember my saying this morning that struck me as exceedingly peculiar." "It seems to fix the time of his death with remarkable accuracy," I said. "And yet, is that possible?" Miss Prothero would only have just left the study. She would hardly have had time to reach the studio. The only way in which I can account for is that he consulted his own watch and that his watch was slow. That seems to me a feasible solution. "I have another idea," said Griselda. "Suppose, Lynn, that the clock had already been put back." "No, that comes to the same thing. How stupid of me. It hadn't been altered when I left," I said. "I remember comparing it with my watch. Still, as you say, that has no bearing on the present matter." "What do you think, Miss Marple?" asked Griselda. "My dear, I confess I wasn't thinking about it from that point of view at all. What strikes me as so curious has done from the first is the subject matter of that letter." "I don't see that," I said. "Colonel Prothero merely wrote that he couldn't wait any longer." "At 20 minutes past 6, said Miss Marple. "Your maid Mary had already told him that you wouldn't be in till 6:30 at the earliest, and he appeared to be quite willing to wait until then, and yet at 20 past 6 he sits down and says he can't wait any longer." I stared at the old lady, feeling an increased respect for her mental powers. Her keen wits had seen what we had failed to perceive. It was an odd thing, a very odd thing. "If only," I said, "the letter hadn't been dated." Miss Marple nodded her head. "Exactly," she said. "If it hadn't been dated." Hang on. Letter hadn't been dated. Miss Marple nodded her head. "Exactly," she said. "If it had..." Oh, I just read that. I cast my mind back, trying to recall that sheet of notepaper and the blurred scrawl, and at the top that neatly printed 6:20. Surely these figures were on a different scale to the rest of the letter. I gave it a gasp. "Supposing," I said, "it wasn't dated. Supposing that round about 6:30 Colonel Prothero got impatient and sat down to say he couldn't wait any longer, and as he was sitting there writing, someone came in through the window or through the door," suggested Griselda. "He'd hear the door and look up. Colonel Prothero was rather deaf, you know, remember?" I said. Miss Marple. "Yes, that's true. He wouldn't hear it. Whichever way the murderer came, he stole up behind the colonel and shot him. Then he saw the note and the clock, and the idea came to him. He put 6:20 at the top of the letter, and he altered the clock to 6:22. It was a clever idea. It gave him, or so he would think, a perfect alibi. And what we want to find, said Griselda, is someone who has a cast iron alibi for 6:20, but no alibi at all. Well, that isn't so easy. One can't fix the time. We can fix it within very narrow limits, I said. Haydock places 6:30 as the outside limit of time. I suppose one could perhaps shift it to 6:35 from the reasoning we have. We have just been following out. It seems clear that Prothero would have not got hang on. But not got. About to go sleepy. Let's see. Narrow limits. Haydock places 6:30 as the outside limit of time. I suppose one could perhaps shift it to 6:35 from the reasoning we have just been following out. It seems clear that Prothero would not have got impatient before 6:30. I think we can say we do know pretty well. Then that shot I heard, yes, I suppose it's quite possible. And I thought nothing about it, nothing at all, most vexing, and yet now I try to recollect, it does seem to me that it was different from the usual sort of shot one hears. Yes, there was a difference. Louder, I suggested. No, Mrs. Marple didn't think it had been louder. In fact, she found it hard to say in what way it had been different. But she insisted that it was. I thought she was probably persuading herself of the fact rather than actually remembering it, but she had contributed such valuable new outlook to the problem that I felt highly respectful towards her. She rose, murmuring that she must really get back. It had been so tempting just to run over and discuss the case with dear Griselda. I escorted her to the boundary wall and the back gate and returned to find Griselda wrapped up in thought. Still puzzling over that note, I asked. No. She gave a sudden shiver and shook her shoulders impatiently. Lynn, I've been thinking, how badly someone must have hated Anne Prothero. Hated her? Yes, don't you see? Still puzzling, don't you see? Yes, don't you see, there's no real evidence against Lawrence. All the evidence against him is what you might call accidental. He just happens to take it into his head to come here. If he hadn't, well, no one would have thought of connected him with the crime, but Anna's different. Suppose someone knew that she was here at exactly 6:20. The clock and the time on the letter, everything pointed to her. I don't think it was only because of an alibi. It was moved to that exact time. It was moved, not mowed, moved to that exact time. I think there was more in it than that, a direct attempt to fasten the business on her. If it hadn't been for Miss Marple saying she hadn't got the pistol with her and noticing that she was only a moment before going down to the studio. Yes, if it hadn't been for that, she shivered again. Lynn, I feel that someone hated Aunt Prothero very much. I don't like it. That's all. Chapter 11. So, Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll get to 12 tomorrow. Y'all be sweet, don't be ugly. Have a lovely crafty night. And I'm going to be doing a couple of little giveaways of some little scarf kits tomorrow on my live. So If you want a chance to win, be there. 3 bells Eastern. Love ya. Bye-bye.